So today I'm going to demonstrate our Altmetric database and all of the tracking and attention seeking it can do in a way that isn't similar to how we normally do it. Normally we demonstrate an institutional way of looking at something. If you are a pharmaceutical company with publications, if you're a publications manager within an institution, if you are in research admin or the research dean or the impact officer for an academic institution or a government body, for example, you'll be familiar with our system as something in order to see in a sort of dashboard way and in a way that can allow for drilling down all of the impact from your institution. Today we're going to focus instead on a certain subject area and in fact a specific body of work, and that is the body of work surrounding the Zika virus. This was actually very interesting for me to put together because I haven't done this kind of research before, particularly around one very particular form of output. And I did it this morning, which means that our data is about as new as you can get. If you found other bibliometric analyses or impact analyses or attention analyses of Zika, as of the 20th of April 2016, that being today, ours is going to be the most I suppose, the most up-to-date. Here's what we're going to cover. So I'll explain before we get going who we are at Altmetric and what Altmetrics actually are as a discipline, as a search area. I'll then, very, very briefly, given the kinds of people who've gone onto this call, I'll explain what the Zika virus actually is. I won't spend too long on that because the expertise on the audience side is stronger than mine. And then I'll give a summary of the publication metrics that there are so far. This is more traditional bibliometrics and combining it with Google search trends and a bit of Altmetric data. And then I'm going to take us into the Altmetric database and show you how the system works, particularly around the items that I found. While I'm in that database, you should get a sense of how our system can be used with respect to being a researcher or being focused on the etiology or the spread of a disease and the attention around that disease or infection or danger or virus, whatever it is. So you should be able to see, and I will demonstrate, how you can monitor not just for new attention around a given set of items, would be those articles, data sets, or whatever, but actually any new mention of anything containing the word Zika, no matter who published it, no matter when it was published, as it is mentioned on the internet in particular sources of attention, which traditionally focus themselves on research, news, blogs, and so forth. I'll go through our exact sources in a second. You should be able to get a sense as well of how researchers can use our system to actually network with people who have not yet been brought into contact. They might be working in parallel or slightly separate areas. You should be, and you will definitely actually see how one can find or engage with positive or sometimes negative criticism surrounding research. And you'll be able to see how Altmetric allows you to discover that certain items have made their way into policy. And that's particularly striking with the Zika body of work as well. So I'll start with who we are then. Altmetric is I think there's about 25 of us now. It's a fairly small company, but we call ourselves a data science company. That in other words means that our product is the understanding of the data that we're also providing. We aggregate attention to research around the world. We do it constantly. We've found about 5 million items for which there is impact outside of traditional scholarly citations and impact factors. And we deliver sort of output or article level metrics, if you like. We would say article level, but we also, of course, track things that aren't articles. And we deliver those to you, to our customers, to readers, to publishers at article level in an engaging, intuitive, visual, graphical way. Altmetrics themselves are a portmanteau word, of course. It's alternative and metrics put together. These are very fast, very rapid indicators. You will see that that is absolutely the case when it comes to this body of work surrounding Zika. They come from different kinds of sources, not just traditional publishers who are now publishing, of course, articles online and have been for about a decade, a little bit more actually, almost 2 decades. These now come from other places, open data repositories, institutional repositories, other sources that Mint identifies for anything it is that a researcher is sharing. And they show non-academic impact. That's particularly the case again with Zika, which is why we wanted to do this. So that is really what it is. Now, in terms of the sources of those attentions that we're looking for, we are looking in news sites. We trawl about 2.5 million stories every single week. That is the fire hose that is online news media. And of those 2.5 million items, we find something like 2,500, maybe 2,700 items which actually do reference research, link to domains like Springer or Elsevier, mention a DOI or a PubMed ID, mention article and journal names that we will pick up through data mining. We look in post-publication peer review sites. I will show you an example of that today. Places like PubPeer, where academic peers are engaging with the research directly. We track about 20 policy sources, including everything that's published by the IMF and the World Bank, Médecins Sans Frontières, government bodies like gov.uk, and so forth. And we mine those in full text within the PDF as well. So if you have a hard-to-find reference at the end of a 300-page PDF that's hosted on the IMF, we have got you covered. We will show you where that item appeared, even if they didn't use an identifier. In the case of Zika, they did, because it's a very particular body doing the publishing, but it can be found without. We integrate reference manager data. We have downloaded the 50 terabytes of the English language version of Wikipedia and have mined that for citations. We look in YouTube descriptions for their videos, Faculty of 1,000, Q&A sites, and of course, social media, which is of course what people think Altmetrics is all about, but is in fact, as you can see, just a small part of it. But we track that along with 10,000 individually followed and scraped blogs which cover research on a regular basis. What are we looking for? We are not looking for phrases like the word Zika. We're not looking for author names. We're not looking for anything like that. We go on a research level. We look for DOIs, PubMed identifiers. That's actually almost exclusively the identifier I used for today's research. Anything that is given one of these, we are automatically looking for. It doesn't matter if you are a researcher belonging to an institution or a body which has licensed our system. We are still looking for that identifier as it appears in our sources. So that's what we're doing. And we're launching ISBNs in the next few weeks as well. So there'll be millions and millions of books and the chapters of books that we'll be pursuing as well, as they are shared, as they're discussed as well. What is the Zika virus? According to the definition from the World Health Organization, which I copied on the 18th of March, this is a disease caused by a virus transmitted by the Aedes mosquito. That, of course, is now subject to a little bit of revision, isn't it? Because the Zika virus has been demonstrated to be something that can be transmitted sexually or otherwise. But nevertheless, that's the main description of the Zika virus and held true from 1952 when it was first discovered all the way through until very recently. People with Zika usually have the symptoms that can include mild fever, skin rashes, conjunctivitis, muscle and joint pain, malaise or headaches. These symptoms last for about 2 to 7 days. Of course, that's terrifying as well, isn't it? Because it's just so similar to a passing slight illness that's so easy to ignore. There is no vaccine currently available. Rather an important point, it means that this is an area of research which it is not optional to track closely. It is something that we must all be aware of and be able to leverage all the data possible in order to look for it and stay on top of it. The best form of prevention at the moment is protection against mosquito bites, although there are some data, there are some articles within the data that I took that talk about the availability of prophylaxis during outbreaks as well. In fact, that's one of the newest items that came out yesterday that was published by, I believe it was an Elsevier journal, actually. And the virus is known to circulate in Africa, the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific. So that's the basic headlines of what we're dealing with. Interestingly, so far, I'll go through the items that we've found so far. I went and took the PubMed test today, searched the word Zika. There are 630 responsive records to that. Now, there are 90 false positives. The Zika, capital Z, capital I, capital K, capital A, is a type of rabbit that is used in unrelated research. So I by hand removed those. There is, of course, the Zika forest, which lends its name to the virus. There are several articles, at least 10, I think, which mention the Zika forest in no relation at all to mosquitoes or to things like particular kinds of viruses. There is, of course, the population that lives in the Zika forest. That had to be removed as well. Amusingly, there are domain names and email addresses and author names which all correspond to Zika. There you can see a snapshot of somebody who's got a name Zika. That is actually ZI and then KA being cardiology, the cardiologist in Norway. So that had to be excluded. As you can see, the rest of that article has nothing to do with Zika. That leaves you with about 540 items as of today directly related to Zika virus research, whether it's about sharing the data surrounding Zika, which is the case in 2 or 3 of the articles. It's purely about data policy. That counts, though, as part of it. Whether it's about direct research that leads to huge innovations, like understanding that microcephaly is related to Zika, and that, I don't know how to pronounce it, I think it's Guillain-Barré syndrome, is also apparently related as well. Those all go into the general amount of research. So we end up with 407 of those 540 items, which is the entire history of Zika research is 540 items, or pretty much around there. I must have, I'm sure, had some 1 or 2 perhaps that I missed, but I did spend a long time clearing that list up. 407 of them were published in the last 3.5 months, which means we're looking at, in the words of one researcher, essentially a bibliometric big bang, as I've heard it described elsewhere. So it's very, very interesting, very, very recent, very new, very up-to-date. It is happening today. This kind of research cannot rely on purely citations to be understood in its impact. Here's the explosion of that publication activity just taking the last 3 years. So from 2013, when there really were only 3 items that were active in the Zika search, 2014, that more than doubles, goes up to about, I think it's 20 odd. 2015, it's just under 50. 2016, we're at 407, just published this year. And we're only, of course, a third of the way into the year, not even, sorry, about a quarter. And that is an extreme jump in attention. It's encouraging on one side to see that, but we are left with the barren prospect that we have until now had very little research on this in total since 1952, when the first item was published. The Google search trend is pretty interesting because this is, of course, a different kind of search. This is not academic. This is the general population as well as the academic population. It has, of course, hugely spiked. The way that Google counts its search data is not to do with sheer volume. So that peak at the top is listed with a number 100, which is meant to mean maximum intensity based on this graph. Of course, we can see that that is the case. I would imagine that that line is probably not going to jump down that far if we would be able to count the entire year. We'll see at the end of the year how that trend has gone. But it has been a very sudden spike, pretty much at the end of, or during the middle of 2015. That's when it really started to kick in all the way through till now. And then if we have a look at the mentions that Altmetric has found for these items as they appear in the news, as they are mentioned on blogs, as they are shared and discussed on social media, as they form the reference base for Wikipedia, as they appear in policy PDFs from the World Health Organization mostly, as they appear in Faculty of 1000, we see a huge jump as well. In December 2015, there were almost no mentions of any of the items that have ever been published around Zika at all. It was almost like a completely silent landscape. That jumps up quite significantly in January 2016 to 6,000 mentions of these particular items. We're not looking for the word Zika. This is research items being mentioned. A link on a blog, a share on social media, that is a mention. It peaked in March 2016, so last month, when we had, I think it was 11, almost 11, just over 11,000 items. And of course, we're only halfway through, or just over halfway through April now, and we still have at least 6,000 mentions that we have found for items, both old and new, as they happen. So there has been an explosion of the sharing, as well as an explosion of the search term generally being searched, as we saw with Google, and of course the explosion in research. So we're not just seeing an increase in interest, it is of course the research that is changing as well. Some of the highlights from that data before I take us into the system is pretty interesting. So, of course, there are these 540 items which form the base of the actual Zika research that has ever existed. 401 of them have received some kind of attention. So have at least been shared on social media, have formed in part of the reference base for policy or Wikipedia, have been in the news. And news is the driving force for this one, of course. 4,803 news stories have mentioned Zika research directly. 237 stories just for one article. That's the top one that we found. There have been almost 24,000 tweeters, 24,000 users of Twitter, individual users who have tweeted about Zika. There are 3 articles that have actually made it into policy PDFs, which we can find very easily, and a single item which is being discussed on post-publication peer review site PubPeer. Only 2 YouTube videos ever have actually referenced Zika research, and as you can see from my notes there, we can see as well that 126 Wikipedia references exist. I understand that there is a slight bit of audio problem, so I'm going to unplug my headset and use the standard audio. Please feel free to feedback if that's still a difficulty. So you should be able to hear me now. It might be a bit more echoey. I do apologize for that. Okay, fantastic. It looks like everything is fine. So that's sort of the headlines that we have here for now in terms of this. What you're also looking at here in terms of the graph is our heat map for the location of Twitter users around the world. And what is, of course, immediately notable is that in addition to the usual strength of the Western world, where of course Twitter is a strong tool, is the existence of Brazil and South America in general along that line. They are much higher than normal because, of course, that's one of the main outbreak points for Zika virus. So you can see there that the general population is taking an interest there as well. So what I'll do is I will show you the system. I'll pop in and show you what I did. So I have got here, for example, our standard system. This is what it looks like. Normally, if you were an institution of some kind, if you had perhaps several thousand articles, you can see the breakdown. What I did today was I went and created myself, as any of our customers can do, a custom group. Rather than looking at my authors that I've structured in the data or departments, I want to simply query a particular group. And I've called this the Zika Research 1952 to present. You can call it what you like. And what you do once you've created this group is you would click on edit and you would simply paste in the DOIs. The PubMed IDs. There is a single DOI for a response that was on Elsevier that does not have a PubMed identifier. I went and found it myself. So this is the most comprehensive list of identifiers for all Zika research there has ever been. So there are items here from, for example, 1952. If they were to be shared tomorrow, we would pick them up as well. So I paste those in here, 1 per line, nothing special, and then hit save. It takes something like maybe 10 seconds. Sometimes it's as short as 3, but it can take maybe 10 seconds to query our whole database as it exists online. The items that we have found, which we are looking for all the time, those can be found. And what I can then simply do is we can already see the summary. So 540 articles, as we knew, 406 actually get mentions. If we click on that, I'm now going to see the overview of where these Zika research items have been mentioned around the world. You can see my data is already out of date. So I said that there was just over 4,000, I think it was, articles. There's now 4,854 news items that are talking about these items, 500 blogs, and there are many other items that I'll go into in just a moment, actually, that are very interesting. You can see here, there was just no mentions, perhaps 8. Yes, 8 mentions in October 2015, almost nothing, 7 there, 10. It's very, very, very little long tail. 0 mentions in April 2014. It's here, really, that we see that jump. As we saw before, and the heat map that we can zoom in on to see the breakdown of different countries and where all the discussion's coming from. And then we, of course, see straight away the top articles by these. So the realization that Zika is associated with microcephaly is the top item. It has the most mentions. It has a pretty high score, which we can see there. We can see 110 news outlets which wrote, I think it was 200 odd stories. It was that number that I put in before. We can see here 154 news stories from 110 outlets. So even that is even more now. We can see that we're picking them up all the way until the 18th for this particular item. Our data is constantly refreshing all the time, always showing you where the new developments are coming from. Now, I did mention a few highlights before. Some of them are here. If you're a researcher, it's a very good way of being able to keep on top of this pretty large data set. If you're into the Zika virus research, you need to know what's going on or where the discussion might be. This would be the kind of view that you would have. So you can, for example, see there is a single peer review mention, as I described before, and you can immediately go in and have a look at this, which means you can essentially monitor the attention, the types of attention that there are. It is loading a little bit slowly right now. There we go. The association between Zika virus and microcephaly in French Polynesia, 2013 to 15, a retrospective study published in The Lancet. We can see if we open this item particularly and see the attention for it, we can see our authors and all the rest of it. The peer review site up here mentioning this item, we'll see if I click on this, you can see there is a single peer. While the authors are refreshingly explicit about their model assumptions, there are some potentially major data limitations that may constrain the utility of this analysis. Kind of a big deal. That, by the way, that phrase is actually a quotation from this blog, which Altmetric is also tracking, which you can see here is mentioned where it is here. The item comes straight from there. So what's interesting to note, I mean, they go on to describe why this data may be troublesome or perhaps less conclusive than we would be led to believe otherwise. It kind of strikes me that neither in the blog post nor in the response here have these authors felt the need to respond. And that's probably because they don't realize that they're being discussed there. You wouldn't know that you're being discussed here normally, because how could you possibly stay on top of all of the places where your item is mentioned online, especially when you have been featured in 57 news outlets and on 6 different blogs and on Facebook and Wikipedia pages. You have a busy life, one may say. So it's pretty interesting to see. This would be a way that you could make sure that you actually do respond. Altmetric also tracks Q&A sites for the same reason. Authors are called upon or requested kindly to respond either to critiques, to praise, of course, we see as well. Publons is particularly rich in when it comes to praising articles that have been undervalued, or to answer simple questions about the research that just interested parties would like to know about. And there's nothing worse than an unresponsive author, especially when it's not their fault to begin with. So this is one way in which researchers can really reach out to the community, reach out to their fellow peers, and sort of see what's going on. Exactly the same thing is true, as I've described before, about being able to track the kinds of people who are discussing your work, other people who might also be in the same business. You can see the reach on Twitter is fairly large as well. There are tweets from multiple tweets, sometimes from the same user. There are 285 specific users, but they are reaching something like 1.4 million followers in combination. So this is where you can really reach into Twitter, into peer review sites, onto things like Reddit, which has been picked up here as well, and interface and network and combine and collaborate with other people who are working in the same area. In a similar vein, I suppose, a researcher could check on the Wikipedia entries as well. They need to make sure, A, that those Wikipedia entries are correct, in other words, that the citations are being used correctly, and also that they are actually there to begin with. So you can find here, for example, you can see quite a lot of items here. If you have a look at the main ones, you can see that we are picking up each page. The Zika forest features, of course, so does the Zika fever and so forth. What is interesting, and I found this before, was when looking at some of the major stories. So if you go and filter by the news items, if you find the syndrome that it was recently related with, yes, it was this one. Julian syndrome outbreak associated with Zika virus infection in French Polynesia. There's a case study control. This is a very scary extra piece of information that I think it's Guillain-Barré syndrome has been related. It has made its way into various different places. Interestingly, though, it is on the Zika fever Wikipedia page. So if we go and view the Wikipedia page for Zika fever, you can see the description is there, and it has been described and it has been referenced, and we're picking up that. But what is interesting is that it doesn't appear on the Barré syndrome page itself. Perhaps it should. It's the kind of thing that can be corrected by somebody. Given the fact that it is accepted that there is a correlation and an association there, it feels like this has simply not been edited yet by whichever concerned party would be doing that. So that's a way that you can very quickly see whether the management of this data is doing its job, essentially. The other interesting item, and I'll show this now in a different view, is in addition to be able to seeing how this data is being picked up by things like encyclopedias or on peer review sites, is something that I noticed actually back in last month, the policy document side of things. Now, normally, to give you an idea of what normal behavior or standard expected behavior of policy documents is that it usually is the lowest or slowest to accrue. It takes many years sometimes in order for government policy to be, or non-governmental recommendations, to be including citations from the literature. In the case of some items like Cambridge Journal's very famous article, Ethnicity, Insurgency and Civil War, which was published in 2003. It took a good 4 or 5 years before that started showing up in World Bank and IMF documentation. But what we've seen here instead in these items, you can see it's actually only 3 items that have made their way into policy sources at all, but they have all made it multiple times. If we have a look at the real big hitter, the one where we suddenly realized that there was an association between microcephaly and this, you can see it is being picked up multiple times. Now, it was published, if we go back, in February 2016. And the item on the World Health Organization site, which you can see we can follow and open, it's an open data that can be read by anybody. You notice it's also from February 2016. So we are seeing that rapid increase, that rapid adoption, as one would hope, of new data into what are normally slower and sort of less responsive, I suppose, pieces of information on, for example, in this case, recommending certain safeties and adequacies of blood supply during outbreaks. So that is an encouraging thing to see. It is, of course, much more rapid than the traditional citation. It gives you an idea about the real-world application of this data in multiple language. You can see it's French, it's Spanish, it's English. And as those recommendations show up, they will be logged by us automatically. In these cases, we found them through the DOI or the PubMed ID as they are in the citations in the end of the document or at the footnotes. So that's rather interesting to see there as well. So you can sort of get a real sense of how this stuff is finding its way in. So that's rather interesting, I think. What also I found this quite interesting. It is in fact the case that only 2 videos on YouTube have ever been made that reference the Zika virus in terms of their descriptions. I say 2, you can see there are 3 references here, but if we click on them, you'll notice that if we go and look at the video tab, we can see SciShow has created an item called Another Zika Update. If we go and view that, I'll pause it because we don't need the video to actually play. This is how we found it. If you have a look in here, we're passing probably Science Mag, yeah, this one. You'll notice there are 4 there. One of them is just normal journalism, doesn't actually reference the research, isn't itself a domain of research impact, but Cell.com, for example, is. And so what happens is we've found that and have put it in, and you'll see in the second item, I think it also is actually the second one down. It's another video. It's exactly the same one, as far as I remember, yes. And then the third one is a different video. So there are 3 mentions in total of Zika materials on all of YouTube in their as going by their description, 2 of which are the same item. So it is still fairly fresh in the mind of people. So that is an overview of the actual items that have been published. And you can look at them in different ways. You can look at this summary report. You can look at them as a list of articles, and you can order them, of course, by total impact, or you could do it by the reference manager count. So in other words, if you're interested in seeing the Mendeley readership, which you can see is here, and that we want to see the one that is highest first, this one's probably the top one, you can order it in that way, or you can do it in the date that we first saw it. And so you can see sort of the items from the PubMed search that I did, dumped in, looked at in different ways. So you can filter them and match them in that way. I can present them in a tiled fashion as well, so I can see more clearly which of these items have made it into different sources, as you can see by the donuts, as we call them. This by far is one of the strongest. This is one of the strongest in terms of distribution, as you can see. And you can see the activity as well. You can see what was said 5 minutes ago, if there was a discussion 5 minutes ago about microcephaly. And in fact, it appears that I wasn't too far off, actually. 20th of April, 2016, that is, of course, today. At 14:26, I began at 1500. This is British time here. So it's about half an hour ago was the last mention. And it was of this item here, Zika virus in the Americas. That's one of the big ones, too. It was a retweet. And we can see, actually, by looking at these items, you can see what they're talking about. So there's a man here who works between disciplines and across regions. Sorry, lady, Elena. A couple of other people who are writing in different languages. We can see there's a news article that mentioned 2 different items in it. So we get this constant view of these kinds of things. Now, this gentleman, Bjorn Meyer, is an arenavirus worker. If I wanted to, I could copy his username, if I can do it reliably. Let's see. Yes, I think that'll actually be enough. I could have a look in our general database about what other items he's talked about. By unfiltering this view that I have here of just the Zika research, 1952 to present, I can instead have a look at all articles that we have ever found as a company, regardless of publisher or regardless of subject or anything like that. We're now looking at all the research that has an identifier that has been interacted with online. And I can actually go and search that gentleman's name, Meyer Bjorn. You'll notice that it's limiting the search because I've asked for 5 million items. I can search this person's handle and see how they are interacting with other items of research. It could be that this gentleman has only ever shared one item. It could be the case. Or it could be that he is regularly sharing other items. I want to get a sense of this gentleman's work, given as he works within viruses. And I can see here, these are the items which have been shared by him at some point. So if we select this item, for example, we will be finding that this gentleman exists in there as well. Let me demonstrate, for example. This is, yes, one of the items. If we have a look in Twitter, we should at some point, if it's not too many, we should find that Bjorn is down here somewhere. Depends exactly when he shared the item, but it's he'll be sitting within the data here somewhere. So I get a sense of their particular focus. We can see from the description of their own selves how they work, that we can start reaching out and start doing some networking in ways that doesn't rely on traditional citations or anything like that. I'm wondering if I can find him this way. No, he's not on this page. I'm quite interested now. Let's see if we can find him. No, he's not on there. There he is. So he was, this was 24th of March, he shared this item. So you can, that was just to demonstrate that these results are in fact the items he has been interacting with. So you can get a sense of perhaps what he might be reading or where the items get coverage, at least, before he shares them. You can see the other people who overlap with the items that Bjorn Meyer is sharing. You can see the trail of interest and the fact that this gentleman is obviously sharing a lot of data. You can see this means that this could be somebody of key interest to work with, or just to simply watch or follow on Twitter. That's enough sometimes. That can be how people want to interact with our data as well. This is bearing in mind everything that we've ever found. So you can see that Bjorn is looking a lot on Zika, but he's probably got a lot of other items here that aren't necessarily to do with Zika. Here's one, respiratory syncytial, I wish I could pronounce that, virus. So he's a virologist, obviously he's working in that kind of area. So you can see the other items that are related. That's the way in which you can sort of get a sense for particular users' activities within the data that we have. It is, of course, not a complete search of their Twitter profile. Any tweets that they have that do not reference research are not going to be in our database, of course. We're not general internet search. We're not profiling either. So you can get a sense there of how to discover ways in which to interrogate the data. Or you could start to set up alerts based on, let's say, for example, Zika in general across everything that we have found. So we can see, let's see, I want to have mentions from the last week only with the keyword Zika in the title. I want it, let's see, ordered by the date we first saw it, and I want to filter that now. I'm now asking Altmetric to give me the last week's impact data for any item with Zika in the title. Doesn't matter where it's been published. It doesn't matter necessarily who wrote it. We can see this kind of data. And so I can go from the activity tab back to the articles, and I can see that there are some very, very new items here. In fact, I noticed that this is probably our newest item in total. And I know it's very, very new because the data is correct. This is an item that was published. It looks like, when was it published? April 2016. I think it was actually published yesterday. What is interesting is if I click on this, you will notice that the DOI is so new, it's not been registered with Crossref yet, even though it is a legitimate identifier. The PubMed ID does resolve to the data as provided by Elsevier. So you can see that this was, in fact, published on the 15th of April 2016. And it's getting mentions just today, actually. And this is quite an important one, as I mentioned, emergency contraception, a public health emergency, how to respond to Zika without just using things like mosquito nets. So you can see that this item was shared at 12:01 today. So a couple of hours ago, we picked that up. So you can get ahead of, very highly ahead of the impact that's happening right now today for items published pretty much this week. And so you can see that. You can also move slowly down this list and sort of see where some of these items are getting picked up. You can see right away that the moment that some researchers recently discovered what the structure of the Zika virus is, they realized also how they could perhaps interfere with it and how to change it. This item, being as it is very, very new, it is what? Also April 2016. You can see it was the 19th of April yesterday that the press release actually went out. It has been getting coverage all the way through today. And again, we can always feed through to where this mention actually was. We always send you to the actual item as it was online. We won't ever tell you, oh, you've got 40 likes for this item, because likes can't be linked to, they can't be demonstrated to be non-fraudulent. They are very cheap to buy. There are things called like farms that do that. But you can see here, the item has been discovered probably by mining that name and realizing it's a journal. That's what our data mining has done. There's probably, oh, that's interesting actually. Am I correct in thinking that I think we've discovered this purely through data mining? Yeah, because there's no other link on here. Oh, that's great. I have to save this because this is one of the best examples that we can find, because this is something where our data mining tool has really managed to pick up this item, even though it was not linked to or had that. I think that's correct. Yeah, none of those are the items. That's very good. I'm going to bookmark that right now. There we go. So you can see really hard to find data, really, really difficult discoveries, items that must probably escape the attention of research planners, of people who are in medical affairs, of the authors themselves. These kinds of items are the things that we find very easily because we are plugged into that structure, because we are looking for the identifiers. We are mining that data in ways that it's very, very tricky to find by hand. Now, if you wanted to, you could get a bit more detailed. You could, you say we have the last week's worth of data. We could, if we wanted to, filter it by Medline subject if we wanted to. We can order the score in the selected time period, so the last week's worth, and then the highest scores within that time period rather than the highest overall. So you can see which have received intensive attention over the recent period, even if their total attention isn't as high as some. It could be that the ones that peaked early, that were the early discoveries, have not really been spoken about in the last week. They will appear later down. And I can save this in various ways now. I can save this feed of data about anything mentioning Zika as it's discussed. I can either save this as what we call a workspace, which is essentially like a saved search. Articles with the keyword Zika mentioned at least once in the past week. Fairly self-explanatory. I can rename it if I want to as well. And I can save that as my sort of saved search, as my workspace. I can pop over here and see it in my workspaces, where you'll see that I do this quite regularly. If I just quickly search for it, there it is. I could click on this and run that search again. As you can see, you can make very, very complex and very particular searches. You can exclude certain forms of attention. So here, this has to have news, blogs, faculty of 1,000, peer review, policy, and so forth. At least one of those mentions in order to fit into that list. Here are my Zika ones, and I can choose to have a daily or weekly alert. Or I can take the data straight from here into Excel, which is what I did in order to tell you how many tweeters there were overall, for example, for the entire of the subject of Zika. I just downloaded the data in Excel and then added up that column. So you can do that. Or I can have a daily or weekly alert. I'll show you what they look like, actually, because they create very nice preview reports. They might take a little bit of time because it is doing a live version of the same item. There it is. So you can see there are 209 total articles, which we know is half of the items that were published this year. There are that many distinct mentions. Here's the top articles. You can see you have ones with 0. That's the contraception one we were just looking at. The score is yet to be updated on there. It's just a score of just under 1 because it's had one tweet and it was probably from the journal itself, which it counts slightly less as if it were from a medical communicator, for example. You can see the top journals that publish this. The sources of attention still mostly Twitter, not surprising. Blogs outweigh, sorry, they don't outweigh, but blogs outweigh the normal amount that we would see. That's very high. And of course, the huge numbers that we see in news as well. You would get this as a daily alert based on that particular search, that particular subject. And you can do that for absolutely anything that there is there. Now, there is another one as well, which is if you're a bit more savvy, if you're more technically adept than I am, and we're still looking at Zika mentioned at least once in the past week across all publications, and that is there's an API button here. And an API, for anybody who doesn't know, that's an application programming interface. That is the machine-readable version of our code, as opposed to the human-readable version, which you are looking at now. And this code, which I'll click on it once just to demonstrate it. I mean, it won't make any sense. It is the raw output of that data that you can embed into internal business intelligence systems. Now you have a way of embedding our data as you need it in your internal publications planning, medical affairs, newsletters, those kinds of ways of using it, so that the data around the non-academic impact is with you at the moment that you would require it, and even sometimes we wouldn't realize that there is some around it. For example, I think that, we've demonstrated that this item isn't even on Crossref yet properly. It's that new, but nevertheless, we are looking for it already. We are finding that item already. We're finding the mentions of it, whether it's been short-linked or whether it's been long-linked. And with that, that is probably about all I have for this particular subject. As you can see, there are a lot of different types of searching and filtering of data, whether it's the data around this particular subset or everything that I didn't look at. You can filter by publisher. You can query our database by ORCID. You can handle Medline subjects. We even support the PubMed queries, like the complicated ones that are native on that system. All of it's in there. We even have the funding built in, that if it's from PubMed as well, you can filter by funder. It's all pretty compelling stuff. It's all built in and it's all available to the customers who use our system. And so with that, I'm going to go through what are a few questions. How do you keep the list of PubMed IDs current? Yes. One of the great challenges, in fact, is keeping all the lists of everything current. We organize to get feeds from PubMed, either by scraping or by having it delivered. We do that, and also we do that for Crossref as well. So we're plugging into the back-end index, if you like, of every identifier that there is. We do it with SSRN, we do it with REPEC, we do it with URNs now as well. If you use a URN, as is used in Europe, we support those identifiers too. So it's pretty intensive stuff. As you can see, it works because it means that our data is so live that even by the time that I've gone from creating my slides to going in, it starts changing. My Twitter count just went up by 1. Fantastic. I don't know if that's a count on one article or whether you're following me on Twitter now. Oh, it looks like, yes, we are looking at the live data. Yes, absolutely. You'll see the numbers change as we work out. I once tried to time it. I was in Sweden, in Stockholm, and somebody asked me how often does our data refresh? And of course, it depends on the type of data we're talking about. So policy documents, for example, of course, it depends on when we've added them as to when we can crawl them. But when, for example, those we started following the World Health Organization a good few years ago. Well, no, it's about a year and a half ago now. Every time they publish a new item, we are picking that up as they deposit that, of course. And that's contingent upon how quickly they do that. At the moment, they are doing bi-weekly updates, new PDFs. And so we're picking that up as they are loaded onto their server. With Twitter, I've seen it be as fast as 5 minutes before and as slow as 24 hours, which is extremely fast. Yeah, I once shared, I think it was an item about, do extreme weather events cause people to Google or search climate change? It was an interesting idea. And so, yes, we had some interesting fun watching my face appear on the Twitter tab for those items. So you will see that that data move as it data changes. Can you repeat how the original set was created? Was the search done in PubMed, then gathered to create a customized set? Yes, thank you for asking, actually. It was a painful approach because bibliometrics is, of course, quite tricky. And I'm no specialist, of course, either. I went onto PubMed this morning and I typed in the word Zika and I hit enter in order to get the most broad results set that, of course, includes a bunch of false positives. I then, by hand, because I love you all, I went by hand through each individual item and made sure that I was looking at items that were to do with the Zika virus. That meant, in some cases, seeing the words Zika and virus or Zika are in the title, which, if it's happening in 2016, is quite definitely about the Zika virus. Or if it was not obvious, but it was talking about things like dengue fever or yellow fever, I would then have to open the abstract and make sure that the word Zika was appearing there. In some cases, it was not, by the way. There are some cases where they mention the Zika forest, but they're talking about dengue fever. Not many times, about 3 or 4, I think. So I removed those because they weren't actually about Zika. Then I would look at telltale signs like, is it about the rabbits? Is it about the forest or the population and not actually about any kind of viruses? There's musculoskeletal structure studies that include the word Zika. There was one actually that looked like a false positive that was actually not, and that is one that was written about the Austrian support group, and their email address is zecken@zika.co.at. And it's tempting to think that that's false, but Zecken is the German word for tick and is in fact relatively okay to leave in. It doesn't really matter. It was only a brief description of what the group does. It's not actually research, but I left it in anyway. So that's what I did. And I then basically had 2 lists. I had one with 540 or whatever, no, 600 and whatever, the unfiltered list. I then had the other list of the items which were clearly not okay, and I combined them in Excel, and I used a filtering mechanism called COUNTIF to basically check one list against the other. So if this PubMed ID is in that list, please mark it with a 1, and then I added all the 1s together, ordered it by that, and deleted those. So then I had my 540 items, which really were about the Zika virus. I copied the PubMed IDs from the column, dumped it straight into our system, And hey presto, it takes really 3 to 5 seconds. On a bad day, it takes 10 to see everything around, everything that's ever been published on Zika. That's how we did it. If you like, I can send you the Excel documents if you want. You can maybe do some checking for me and make sure that I cleanly did my work. I've had a look at other bibliometric analyses, and my numbers are pretty close to theirs, slightly higher, but that's because there's been more publications since they released their research. So we're certainly not just in the ballpark, but I would say on the right base as well. Let's see, I've answered that one already. Are you going to start following more US policy documents? Yes, we are. We have, obviously NIH is already in there, and there are a couple of others, but yes, we're adding about 4 to 6 different sources every month, and those are international, those are from around the world. They can be in any language, as long as the citation style is something that we can machine recognize. Then we will be adding as much as possible. The US ones are a priority for this year, definitely. Along with Dutch, because Dutch, they operate open government and open data, so there's some good stuff there as well. Is it possible to buy a license to use your Explorer for institutions? How much would it be? Yes, it is possible. The price depends on what type of institution you actually are, and the research outputs and general uses, and whether you need an API license as well. So if you are interested, my email address is on the screen, ben@altmetric.com. Drop me a line, give us an idea about what kind of institution you are, and I'll tailor a quotation and, if you like, even a custom demo for you based on some of your data as well, and describe how it is that we can design a top-down view of your institutional data against the background of all the data that we have as well, because we're already following your items. We just have to filter it down to the items that you want by author, by department, if you're in the pharma industry, by drug, perhaps by report group or study group, whatever it is that you divide in there. So that's those. Can you send me the list of your Zika research? Yes, of course I will, sir. Absolutely. I'll make it available to everybody. We'll follow up in the next couple of days. And we'll make sure that everybody gets a copy of all the versions of the items I had, the unfiltered list and the filtered list as well. Thank you very much. That looks like everything from everybody. So thank you very much for joining, and I hope it was useful. And we will see you on the road, and I look forward to hearing from some of you very soon. Thank you.